All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to No Kings on the Hill, episode 33. This is Dr. Hill, and thanks for tuning in this afternoon for episode 33. We usually go live every Wednesday at 5 p.m. Central, 6 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, X, and Facebook through the Patriots Prayer Network, and YouTube and Facebook at No Kings on the Hill, X at Dr. Hill 42, and at Kick on No Kings on the Hill. Didn't feel very well yesterday, so I rescheduled it for this afternoon. And as you see our website scrolling across the bottom of the screen, also please check out No Kings on the Hill at drhill.com. Please sure to check it out there. You can find the links to all of our socials, previous episodes, and ways to stay connected with the show. Don't forget that you can also subscribe for free and gain access to our weekly blogs. And if you'd like to help us expand this platform, you can subscribe to one of our 3 paid tiers. That helps us out and gives us access to access to subscriber only perks, like a chance to be a host on the show once a month, daily subscriber only live streams, Discord chats, and even a say in what we cover next. As always, you're there. If you're able to leave us a review and let us know how we're doing, we appreciate it. That helps us improve and helps more people find the show. So to this afternoon, we got a lot to cover. In fact, I think it might be helpful to slow our roll just enough to make sense of this wild political week. Now, if you're just scrolling through headlines, it can look like a bunch of unreleased stories. One day it's the Senate parliamentarian, next day it's the Supreme Court back congressional efforts and to influence districting. Then it's the Federal Reserve refusing to bow down to presidential pressure. Then Congress is trying to fix Medicare drug pricing. Oh, and Republicans are trying to add funding for Ukraine to a spending package. And if you're watching cable news, CNN will say, look how Trump is destroying our democracy. Fox will say, look how the liberals are attacking President Trump, and MSNBC will say something that makes us question our lively choices. But I don't think these stories are random. I don't think they're the result of 5 different newspapers randomly selecting which stories to cover each day. I think a single question connects these stories. Who is permitted to wield power in American constitutional system? That was the question the founders cared about. It's not who has good intentions. It's not who says the right slogans. It's not who claims to be protecting democracy. The constitutional question is who has lawful authority, where does the authority come from, and what limitations are placed on it? And if you're a conservative, originalist, pro-Trump American, that question is especially important right now. President Trump's second term isn't just a fight over policy. It's a constitutional crisis. It's a fight between elected officials and entrenched power, between Article 2 and the administrative state, between Article 1 and congressional gamesmanship, between the states and federal overreach, between the constitutional text and decades of judicial improvisation. So this afternoon, I want to walk you through this week's biggest stories with that lens in mind, not to incite outrage or panic, not as red versus blue noise, but as a conservative constitutional analysis of power. The standard around here remains the same. No kings in the White House, no kings in the courts, no kings in Congress, no kings in the agencies, no kings in the permanent bureaucracy, no kings period or anywhere. So let's get into it. So the way it does is I'm going to start with my intro. After I do that, I'll go through introduce each segment, and then I'll take and look at the comments before, in between each segment, and maybe answer some questions. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with the intro. And then when I get to segment 1, I'll announce that, and then I'll start going over, looking and see if there's any comments to answer any questions. So this afternoon, we have a theme episode. The theme is the Constitution strikes back, and I mean that literally. Liberals and conservatives have been told for years that our Constitution is a problem to be managed, that originalism is too rigid. Well, that separation of powers is antiquated. Federalism is inconvenient. The administrative state is necessary because voters can't be trusted to elect good officials. Judges need to save us when voters make the wrong choice. Americans can decide what Congress is when it's too stubborn to decide. Experts should run the country because the people are too emotional, too ignorant, or too populist to be trusted with raw democratic power. And then came along Donald Trump. And whether you think he's wonderful or horrible in style, personality, or tone, President Trump did uncover something really important. Lots of people in Washington don't actually fear lawlessness in the abstract. They fear losing control. They fear losing power. This is why every action Trump takes is met with cries that this is unprecedented, authoritarian, dangerous, or somehow going to make America descend into chaos. Meanwhile, the permanent bureaucracy, activist courts, regulatory agencies, and procedural choke points are characterized as guardians of democracy. But someone committed to originalism should ask a different question. We shouldn't be asking, do I like Trump, or do I like the outcome, or does this help or hurt my side today? The question should be asking that is, what does the Constitution actually authorize? Article 1 gives legislative power to Congress. Article 2 gives executive power to the president. And Article 3 gives judicial power to the courts. The states retain vast amounts of power under the 10th Amendment, and the people have rights that the government does not grant and therefore cannot casually take away. This is the structure of our government, and that structure is not decorative. It isn't something you hang in a classroom to show where stuff is. It is the operating system of our republic. So when the Senate parliamentarian rules to block part of a Republican funding bill, the question isn't simply whether you like the underlying policy proposal. The question is whether procedural gatekeeping by bureaucratic elites has become a substitute for elected accountability. When the Supreme Court refuses to save a Democratic partisan gerrymandering scheme in Virginia, the question isn't whether Democrats will get the short end of the stick. The question is whether the court should be rewriting state election law every time one party doesn't like how maps are drawn. When the Supreme Court severely limits the use of the Voting Rights Act in rare race-conscious districting, the question isn't whether we prefer the partisan outcome. The question is whether the Constitution even permits the government to sort Americans into different voting groups based on race. When the 15th Amendment was written to forbid racial discrimination in voting. When Kevin Walsh was sworn in to the White House last week to take over the Fed, the question isn't whether pundits think it looks too political. The question is why we've treated an institution with such vast power over money, credit, inflation, jobs, and the entire economy as if it should float above democratic accountability. When the Supreme Court leaves drug price negotiation under Medicare in place, the question isn't just whether lower drug prices sound good. The question is whether Congress has delegated too much power to agencies to micromanage markets, push entire industries, and redefine strong-arm tactics like negotiation. And when a House discharge petition forces Congress to vote on aid to Ukraine over bipartisan leadership's objections, the question isn't just whether you support aid to Ukraine. The question is whether Congress is finally beginning to act like Congress or whether individual members are using procedural maneuvers to drag America back into overseas entanglements that voters did not clearly support. That's why originalism matters. Originalism isn't a love of nostalgia. It isn't an appreciation for powdered wigs and parchment. Originalism is the framework that insists government must stay within the confines of the legal authority the people actually gave it. It requires us to say that the Constitution means something before a judge, agency, cable news panel, or elected politicians decide what they want it to mean this week. And that is why the pro-Trump constitutional argument is stronger than many Trump critics will admit. It's not the argument that Trump can do whatever he wants just because he's president. It's the argument that just because the administrative state may not like President Trump doesn't make his presidency one bit less legitimate. It's the argument that American voters are no less legitimate just because Washington elite institutions may hate the choices they make. Congress is not optional just because bureaucrats are more efficient. The states are not administrative subdivisions of Washington, D.C., and the courts are not the National Policy Board wearing black robes. This afternoon's episode is about that. If we're going to stay with no kings on anything, then no king hiding behind procedure. We can't hide behind anything. And no king hiding behind the slogan of our democracy when what they really mean is our control. This afternoon, we are going to walk through 5 stories that highlight exactly where the battle lines are drawn. And we will ask the same question with each story. Does this move power closer to constitutional accountability or farther away from it? So getting to segment 1, it's Senate parliamentarian reconciliation and the procedural swap. Okay, well, nothing really worth reading over anyways, or not really much comments to discuss. So there's comments, but they're all trolling. So let's get going. Let's start with an innocuous procedural anecdote that's pretty damn revealing. The Senate parliamentarian reportedly prevented about $1 billion in security upgrades to the White House campus and President Trump's new ballroom from being included in a Republican bill to fund immigration enforcement agencies for the next 3 years. Republicans didn't fight with her over whether the White House needs security. They fought with her over whether the funding complied with the reconciliation instructions. Okay, the Senate parliamentarian is enough to make any American click off this program and eat some lunch meat before, but hear me out. This is important. Our voters do not elect the parliamentarian. The parliamentarian does not run on any ballot. The parliamentarian is not a member of Congress. Yet in today's Senate, this unelected official can determine what does and absolutely does not make it through the reconciliation process. All right, but we need to be careful about how we frame this as a problem. Strictly speaking, I love the rules. As a originalist, I believe procedure matters. The Constitution explicitly allows each chamber of Congress to write its own rules. So when I say this, I'm not saying Republicans should completely ignore procedure whenever it gets in their way. That would not be conservative or constitutional. What I am saying is that Washington created a system that allows elected officials to hide behind unelected bureaucrats and obscure procedural excuses. We wanted to do it, but the parliamentarians said no. Congress can say, we love this policy, but the rule book rebukes us. Congress can say, we want to secure the border with a physical barrier, but it's really hard. Washington is the swamp. Americans elected a president who made our border and our national security crisis central parts of his campaign. They elected Republicans and Democrats to Congress who promised they would restore law and order. And then Washington says, please hold. Let me see if that fits in our procedural box. Yes, rules are important, but so is accountability. The Constitution states Congress shall have the power of the purse. Congress shall debate, vote, appropriate, and then face the voters. If a member wants to fund White House security, they should come to the floor and defend that funding. If they think it's wasteful, they should vote against it. The beauty of Congress hiding behind process is that it provides politicians with cover. Politicians can vote yes and pretend they're trying. President Trump has taken the institution of Washington and forced every one of these hypocrisy points to the surface. Donald Trump asks for funding and crazy stuff starts popping out of closets. Judges are suddenly ruling on immigration. Trump sets the limits and the bureaucracy issues a violation. Trump fires up the base and everybody's Ocasio-Cortez spying. Trump declares a national emergency and suddenly the inspector general gets a press release. He pushes, they push back, and voters are supposed to sit idly by and take this. No, democracy is not allowing every single procedural hill Washington has created over the last few decades to stay intact. The Republican form of government we live in promises to elected officials who will use the power granted to them lawfully and then answer the people for how they use that power. Republicans and Trump supporters, instead of attacking the rules, attack the cowardice of Republicans who use the rules as a crutch. If you want broader border security funding, pass a bill that funds border security. If you think White House security is ridiculous, debate that on the floor. If you want to say no, say no. Quit acting like the bureaucrats are the priesthood. They're not. They're public servants who will answer to somebody someday. Elected officials are answerable to the voters. That is constitutionally accountable. Letting bureaucrats guard your sacred procedural cows is running a managed democracy. So we've got to fix this shit. It's getting ridiculous with how that stuff goes. What that one sentence, the procedure should reign in their power. It should not become a convenient place for politicians to hide when they don't have the guts to cast a vote. Okay, so we went from congressional procedure power to election procedure because this next story involves maps, courts, race, and whether judges should step in to save shitty partisan power grabs masquerading as democracy. All right, so considering, I say we're not doing too bad view-wise, considering I don't usually do this at 1 o'clock on a Wednesday, on a Thursday afternoon, so I'm actually surprised we've got as many viewers as we have right now. So not bad since I'm not our usual time. But all right. That's not what I wanted. That's what I wanted. Sorry. Okay, so now we'll get on to Supreme Court, Virginia redistricting and the Voting Rights Act. So let's head to the judiciary. Earlier this week, the Supreme Court refused to intervene in the Virginia redistricting battle. As a result, Virginia's current congressional map will remain in place for now after the Virginia Supreme Court ruled there were issues with the mid-decade redistricting effort according to the state constitution. Democrats asked the Supreme Court to save the newly drawn map. They declined. From a partisan standpoint, yes, this is politically favorable. Let's not kid ourselves, but the stronger argument to make is not simply our side won. The stronger argument is that this is how the Constitution works. Election laws should not be upended every time a political party discovers a new procedural advantage. State election procedures are important. State constitutional rules are important, and federal courts should be extremely reluctant to intervene and override a state court's interpretation of state's law. Now, I had that Supreme Court decision the last week's Louisiana, or actually it's 2 weeks ago now for Louisiana v. Calais. That decision ended up being a very more significant along with that. For years, the Voting Rights Act has been weaponized to do more than prohibit intentional discrimination in voting, which is constitutional and perfectly acceptable. It has been used to strong-arm states into race-based districting decisions. The Supreme Court pushed back on that practice the other week. The opinion written by Chief Justice John Roberts reminds us that the 15th Amendment prohibits intentional racial discrimination in voting. It does not empower the government to engage in racial sorting for generations to come. Here's why that matters. The Constitution does not demand colorblindness because race has never been important in American history. Of course, race mattered. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were added to the Constitution because race, incredibly and horrifically, matter. But the solution the Constitution provides for racial discrimination is not endless governmental racial classifications. That's what the left has stumbled into. They claim to hate racial discrimination, but the only solution they will accept is constant government classification by race to achieve this perceived or preferred electoral results. They claim our democracy is holy, but when voters or states pass rules they don't like, they turn to the courts. They claim judges should not be politicians, but demand court intervention when the political landscape becomes unfavorable. Originalism is not about willfully denying discrimination. It's about taking the Constitution at its own words. The 15th Amendment says citizens shall not have their vote denied or abridged by reason of race. That is clear racial discrimination. It is not a grant of authority to draw race-based districts. However, the politicians feel like drawing them for the next 100 years. And this brings me to President Trump's judges. President Trump has appointed judges who will look at these issues and ask, what does the text of the Constitution actually say? What did the Reconstruction Amendments actually mean? What power did Congress actually get? What power did the states actually retain? That is exactly what happened this other week. And this is why the left is freaking out about our judges. They know the old game they've been playing for decades is much more difficult now. They know it's over. Progressives have essentially used the courts to constitutionalize their policy preferences for years. But originally, the Supreme Court is saying, if you want that policy, pass a law. If you want to pass a law, do it within the bounds of the Constitution. If you want to change how states conduct elections, point to the enumerated authority that authorized you to do so. That isn't judicial activism. That is enforcing the separation of powers. But to be clear, Republicans shouldn't act like we think courts are never allowed to check state governments. If a Republican legislature violates its state constitution, that's okay for a court to say. If a Republican legislator draws an intentionally discriminatory map based on race, courts should have something to say about that too. Originalism isn't about shielding Republicans from the Constitution, but the broader theme of these redistricting rulings is a good one. The Supreme Court is saying federal judges should be skeptical of racial balancing. They should respect legitimate state election rules, and they should not be in the business of drawing election maps. That's good for the Constitution, and frankly, it's good for America. Because if every state legislative map winds up in the federal court as a racial engineering project, we stop actually having elections where citizens attempt to persuade citizens. We'll instead have elections decided by lawyers, consultants, expert witnesses, and federal judges who determine how much race needs to factor into every district. That is not what the American constitutional system is about. The Constitution guarantees equal citizenship in this country. It does not establish permanent racial entitlement programs. The Constitution forbids racial discrimination. It does not require that the government to make the race organizing principle of political power. So, from maps to money, switching gears from the election maps to cash, because this next story is about the Federal Reserve, Kevin Warsh, and why you've suddenly heard so much about institutional independence from newspapers that have zero problem appointing political hacks when President Obama was in office. And it's getting crazy that, let's have the Federal Reserve be separate from the federal government when it's not even part of the Constitution. Yeah, let's do that. Really makes sense. All right. See how we're going there. All righty. Please, if you're no matter whether you're on TikTok, Facebook, wherever you're on, please tap that screen, hit those likes, repost, share. If you're on TikTok, please help with the gift goals or daily heart me's. Let's try to get some more people in here. I know it's not my usual time, so views are still pretty decent for it being middle of the day. I'm going to go ahead and get started with segment 3, which is the Kevin Warsh, the Federal Reserve, and Democratic accountability. So let's discuss the Federal Reserve. Kevin Warsh is expected to be sworn in as Fed chair this week, or I think he actually already has been. This was yesterday, Monday or Tuesday, at the White House, which with President Trump will host. Reporters have made a big deal of the fact that this breaks with recent precedent, with the last Fed chair sworn in at the White House being Alan Greenspan back in 1987. He was confirmed by the Senate 54-45. All of a sudden, everyone in the institutional class gets nervous. They warn that this is threatening the Fed's independence. They warn that the optics are terrible. They demand that the White House maintain symbolic distance from the central bank. Okay, let's discuss independence. Where does the Fed appear in the Constitution? It's not in Article 1. It's not in Article 2, and it's not in Article 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7. This power Congress created. Congress gave it control over interest rates, money supply, inflation, credit conditions, bank stability, employment, and the cost of living. It controls whether families can afford homes, whether businesses can access credit, whether retirees can preserve their savings, and whether federal debt becomes more costly. And yet we're told that this huge institution should be insulated from politics? Well, sure, some insulation makes sense. Markets crave stability. We don't want monetary policy being weaponized as a day-to-day campaign tactic. Nobody wants interest rates decided by a Twitter poll. But here's the problem. Constitutionally speaking, the more power you have, the more accountability you require. Our founders did not set up a government in which the most consequential decisions are made by people insulated from voters. They divided power. They checked the power. They made sure that powerful decisions were ultimately accountable decisions. And so when Trump holds his swearing-in ceremony at the White House for Warsh, the press sees it as the politicization of the Fed. I see it as something else. I see a reminder that this guy has tremendous power, but that power doesn't float free. Congress created the Fed. Its officers are appointed through one of the Constitution's enumerated mechanisms. The president nominates, the Senate confirms, the voters get to know who did their job and who didn't. The voters have an indirect but very real connection to that power. That is not scandalous. That is Article 2 and the appointments process working as intended. Sure, should Warsh take orders like a puppet? Of course not. Should the Fed push rates around for partisan reasons? No. Should we insist that monetary policy be serious, disciplined, and focused on low inflation? Absolutely. But for some reason, the idea that this institution becomes pristine just because it can build a fortress miles away from elected officials, that's not constitutional law. That's just some bureaucrat's personal preference, and that's the theme here. When Trump exercises democratic control over executive institutions, the media tells us he's undermining norms. A lot of those norms were developed to prevent conservative presidents from actually running the government they were elected to lead. Remember this next time you hear that Warsh swearing in threatens the independence of the Federal Reserve. The president was elected. The Senate confirmed him. The people will decide if he does a good job. That's accountability. And if Warsh leads a return to sound money, if he fights inflation, if he disciplines the Fed after years of being taken for granted by our elite politicians, if that happens, then the problem won't be that Kevin Warsh got sworn in at the White House. The problem for Trump critics will be that the constitutional system worked without them. The Federal Reserve may be independent in judgment, and it is not independent from the Constitution. Now let's transition to the other part into the next episode, because Congress has also created massive government power that it's delegated to unelected agencies. So I'm going to get into the Medicaid, drug care, the drug pricing, coercion, and the administrative state here in a second, and then probably going to bring up a couple other, well, I can't really share them, but I'm going to cover a couple other topics that I had pulled up on the administrative state, because I don't think people really understand how that truly works. I'm trying to remember where I saved my, hold on a second. I was trying to remember where I saved my research I put together on the administrative states. I had everything put up. That's what I was looking for. Okay. All right, let's get on to segment 4. Still some apps, but nothing new on comments. All right. Let me get on this. So, okay, now the Supreme Court has refused to hear appeals from drug companies on Medicare's drug price negotiation program. So that program remains in place. On the other area where conservatives need to tread lightly, least we misunderstand the public, is prescription drugs. Because when you say lower drug prices to the public, what do they hear? Good, I want lower drug prices. And you know what? They're right. Drug prices are too high. Healthcare prices in general are often opaque. They're distorted. They're unfair. The system of drug manufacturers and insurance companies, pharmacy benefit managers, federal programs, and patients is a dumpster fire. So the conservative response cannot be, that's fine, leave it alone. What the conservative response should be is, let's fix the price problem, but let's not solve one distortion with an even bigger constitutional distortion. Drug pricing under this Medicare negotiation program raises a serious question. When the federal government controls access to such an enormous market and says, hey, we'll let you sell to our customers if you negotiate with us. Otherwise, we'll sue you into oblivion and destroy your company. Is that negotiation? Or is that coercion cloaked with flowery language? Originalism comes into play again here. Congress can spend money. Congress can place conditions on the receipt of federal funds. Congress can regulate interstate commerce. But Congress increasingly delegates all real policymaking to agencies by legislating vague statutes and hoping no one notices. That is the administrative state. And when agencies set prices, when agencies control market access, when agencies write the compliance rules, set the penalties, and decide whom to enforce those penalties against, they are simultaneously exercising legislative, executive, and quasi-judicial powers. Article 1 does not give them that authority. Article 2 does not give them that authority. Separation of powers was designed to fight this sort of concentrated power. I want to be clear, the Supreme Court's decision not to hear this case does not mean the conservative justices love every aspect of this program. It just means the Supreme Court isn't reviewing those cases right now. My point is that politically speaking, this is coming. This is something President Trump can actually do something about. If President Trump wants to fight big pharma prices, that's great. Expose the middleman. Shine the light on drug pricing, but calling it negotiation when the feds have that kind of power is political murder-suicide. A pro-Trump Republican position on this issue should be populist and constitutional. Fight high drug prices, yes. Go after big pharma, absolutely. Punish drug companies that actually are abusing government-created advantages the way they were set up. But let's not pretend like the only way to protect seniors is to give vast and unchecked power to federal agencies permanently. President Trump's lane here is to attack the rigid American healthcare market, drain the swamp by empowering Congress again to withhold elected power, transparent laws, competition, not the bureaucracy that can decide to punish entire industries they dislike by administrative edict. Because drug companies are the enemy this time, energy companies will be the enemy next time. Gun manufacturers will be the enemy next time if it's Democrats and religious institutions or political opponents. They keep changing. Conservatives cannot support unelected bureaucrats having unlimited administrative power just because we happen to agree with one of their actions. Conservatives need to stand for something different, something better, something populist, and something actually constitutional. Populism without constitutional limits is just tyranny with applause breaks. Help the people fight back against rigid systems, but keep lawmaking in Congress. And that actually brings us nearly into foreign policy segment, Russia, Ukraine. The question every single American first constitutional conservative needs to be able to answer to this. Who decides when we spend American money, American weapons, and American credibility fighting wars abroad? I think there was some stuff messing on that, but I gotta pull this over where I can show it and read it. I'm gonna share it with anybody who's on people on my will be able to they're watching me on my normal podcast channels will be able to see this page that I'm sharing. Anybody who's watching on TikTok won't be able to, but I am going to read it, so you'll be able to hear it. All right. Well, actually, I got to put it up first. Hold on a second. I got to switch my scenes and put it up. And the stage. There we go. All righty. That's what I was trying to do. All righty. So let me read this. I'll get it increased a little bit in size so y'all can read it easier. But go through kind of where the administrative state comes in. Well, I don't think a lot of people understand there. Okay. So in the U.S. federal system, a bill becomes law, a statute first, and only after that it may be translated into administrative policy and regulations by executive branch agencies. A cleaner way to say this is Congress makes statutory law, agencies implement that law through regulations, guidance, permits, enforcement policies, and administrative procedures. The bill starts as a proposed legislative action in Congress. To become law, it must pass the House and Senate in identical form and then be presented to the president. The president may sign it, blah, blah, blah. The statute may be very detailed, or it may set broad goals and assign implementation to an agency, which more today we see this broad goals assigned and not really very detailed statute, and it goes to implementation to agencies. For example, Congress may say that an agency shall issue regulations, may prescribe rules, or shall administer a program. That delegation is what gives the agency legal authority to act. Agencies cannot simply create binding federal regulations on their own. They need authority from Congress or other lawful source. But still, they pretty much become the lawmakers today. And per se, they don't actually create law, but the actual laws that truly affect us, that we pay fines for, get in trouble for, are actually created and designed by the actual agencies in the government. Because most of the bills that Congress makes today are like that. They're a broad instruction manual, or saying, hey, we want this is what we want to accomplish, and force it how you need to accomplish this goal. They don't actually give them much guidance on how to accomplish that goal. They just say, hey, let's accomplish this goal with this bill, do what you need to. And so we end up with these agencies that it turns the statute in to administrative policy through rulemaking. Under the Administrative Procedures Act, agencies generally publish a proposed rule, explain their legal authority and reasoning, allow the public to comment, consider these comments, and then publish final rule. Federal Register explains that agencies must follow an open public process when issuing regulations and must publish proposed and final rules with a statement of rulemaking authority. But the trick is finding and they do issue it and put those for public rulemaking, but very few people actually pay attention to once the bills get signed past the president, actually paying attention to them as they go to the individual agencies and get put into actual policy of what you see that you get charged or arrested for. So that's one thing you want to start watching the agencies more on the actual policy and official rulemaking of it versus the actual legislation. Because when it comes down to the majority of the bill or the law that's enforced through the policies, it comes down in that position on the administrative state. Because once it's what you see published in the Federal Register versus what you actually see if you look at the bill once it passes Congress, look like two total separate things, because you've got double, sometimes triple the amount of pages because of all of the policy and procedures that they've put in there to enforce that rule by. When it could have been a 3-page, maybe when it passed, it was a 3 or 4 page, depending on how many amendments were added to it, 3 to 4 page document, maybe 10 at the most, and now it's a 400 page document. It's crazy. So administrative policy is obviously broader than regulations. Some agency actions are binding rules. Others are guidance documents, manuals, enforcement policy, interpretive statements, grant conditions, licensing procedures, or internal operating instructions. Regulations usually grow through formal rulemaking. Guidance often explains how an agency interprets or plans to enforce law, but it generally cannot create new legal obligations by itself unless backed by valid statutory or regulatory authority, which some agencies have been given that these days. And because it's not for criminal or not anything that's a criminal where you can be arrested for, but smaller like civil charges, it has been fines, $100 fines, anything like I think under $10,000 fine, they can actually do through those procedures. And you see it all the time with the EPA. When you own a business, you see it with the EPA, you see it with all these other agencies. And then you go through the administrative law justice system, which is a panel of judges, not a jury of your peers. And trying to actually get a regular court, a district federal court or a Supreme Court to take up your case and claim that they have jurisdiction to hear it is fairly hard. In some instances, it feels like it's almost near impossible. And so you don't get your true constitutional representation, which is why a lot of people argue that the administrative state is unconstitutional. Because when you go through the administrative law justice system, you don't get a jury of your peers. So it's the same thing. And that's when I was talking about this on my live the other day. And when it comes to executive orders and executive memorandum, pretty much what the president is doing is asking those agencies to change the policies that actually enforce the law or the regulation. And so in a way, it changes the law to a point. So legislation becomes, the easiest way to say it is this one, but I was trying to get my other sites through here. I had some quotes put in here. I can't remember it. Let me see. Actually, no, that's not what I want. Let me see. I get something else. I'll show one other thing. I'm trying to find my document. I'll have to do it on my Google Docs. So I was trying to say. So I'll pretty much go through Frohan and Carey. This is all pretty much administrative stuff here. I'll go over it and kind of read it. But that is, we are concerned with the extent to which rules handed down by our governing authorities now fail to abide by procedures and are failed to include crucial elements necessary to conform to the rule of law, and so as incapable of providing that rules ordering benefits to our society. At its root, the problem is constitutional. To the extent our laws are no longer formulated and proclamated according to the process laid down in the actual text and corresponding morality of our Constitution, the Constitution is no longer operative and our governors are no longer bound by the rule of law. Moreover, progressives in particular should be alarmed that some 94% of the income gains during President Obama's first term have gone to barely 1% of the population, while incomes have declined for the lowest 93%. It's talking about the top 1%. And this book was written back in like 2008, 2009, that these quotes are coming from. Wealth will continue to be created, even in the absence of the rule of law. Ironically, the pursuit of a more equal distribution of that wealth often results in formation of oligarchies consisting of those who know best how to manipulate rules, regulations, and especially discretion-wielding officials to serve their own ends. Moreover, Americans, including the judges and lawyers whose duty it is to uphold the law, no longer recognize the necessity of law's internal morality. One central cause of Congress's loss of power has been its refusal to do the hard work of negotiating and drafting statutes that comport reasonably well within the requirements of the rule of law. Members of Congress pass vague statutes directing executive agencies to solve various problems such as workplace safety, pollution, and drug use. In one sense, such statutes constitute claims of increased power, ignoring the federal structure of the framers' Constitution and the limits of its enumerated powers, which actually disempowers Congress. Why? Because rather than do the hard work and risk the political fallout of crafting specific rules aimed at promoting specific goods or ameliorating specific evils, members of Congress prefer to take credit for enacting broad, well-meaning legislation and then overseeing, investigating, and blaming agency personnel for the problems and failures they inevitably follow. Most, but not all of these theories are connected to reform movements intended to expand the role of government, principally the national government, and to improve the operations of government in the execution of its expanded powers. Where the administrative state becomes unconstitutional isn't its current state, where it's legitimately its own fourth branch of government. It's where it literally becomes its own fourth branch of government, separate from the control of the president or Congress, supposedly separated from politics. As Frohan and Kerry stated, they assumed that an independent administrative apparatus was necessary to provide considerable latitude for the introduction of expertise in the pursuit of efficiency and implementing policy free from democratic controls. By way of response, let's take this up at the level of first principles because the Constitution already resolves it. Federal law, when it is made in pursuance of the Constitution, is supreme. Full stop. Alexander Hamilton said as much unequivocally in Federalist 33. The Supremacy Clause only binds states to laws made pursuant to the Constitution. But when such laws have been enacted, all state action subversive of them is an act of usurpation. The Supremacy Clause does not give states an opt-out because they don't like the manner of enforcement. That kind of goes into immigration enforcement, but the other ones were a couple different quotes from Frohan and Kerry and Philip Hamburger on administrative state and administrative law. So we've really got to pay more attention to that type of stuff, how our bills are made. I'm really proud of this week of see how many people on the Republican side have actually voted out incumbents that have lost to their challengers, which shows that we can enforce term limits through actually going and showing up at the polls and voting them out of office, which is what we pretty much saw happen this last week, was we saw them get voted out of office while people that were in office didn't. So, and I don't even know if RJ's still in there, but the facts, I'm not, RJ, I don't know anybody, if he's even still in here, but I'm not monologuing, I'm doing my podcast. So I said that I'm not going to be doing the first hour. I would not be doing any multi-guest on TikTok because I'm going through my podcast. I'm just showing it on TikTok. So again, please let's get those likes, shares, repost going. If anybody wants to ask any questions. I don't know what pictures you're talking about. Oh, no, the thing behind me that's called My Books Are Knocked Over, and that's called a 4-year-old child. It's called a 4-year-old child, and I have no book. I gotta get some bookends so my school books won't keep on falling down. That's why my books are all falling down like that. It's because of that. But no. So yeah, please hit those likes, repost, shares, tap that screen. If you're on TikTok, please help with the gifts and gift goals or the daily heart me's. And then I'm going to get going here in a second. I was trying to add some more stuff in because I got through those first couple segments a little faster than I planned on. So that's what I was trying to see if there was any good comments to question, but I don't see any so far. I did get a decent, there's good 30 or 40 comments, just nothing that's really worth answering any questions to or anything. So let's get going here to segment 5. And then after that, it's the closing. That's why I was trying to find some other stuff to add into it that I don't have on my notes. So I'm going to go on segment 5, which is Ukraine discharge petitions and American First Constitutionalism. Alrighty, let me get that started up. Okay, so now Ukraine, GOP backers of a Ukraine and aid Russian sanctions package have enough signatures on a discharge petition to force a vote in the House. By signing the petition, lawmakers are circumventing Republican leadership and taking the issue directly to the floor. which is another parliamentarian rule or process they can use. The AP reports that the package under consideration would provide $1 billion in security aid and $8 billion in loans to Ukraine. This is where Republicans split. American First conservatives say Ukraine has already received too much money. Europe should pay more. And voters didn't send Congress to Washington to write endless checks for foreign wars. Republicans who take the traditional foreign policy approach think America must stand tough against Russia aggression in Ukraine. Okay, for a pro-Trump POV, Eileen, America first. But let's take it constitutional. Congress has constitutional powers over war, spending, foreign governance, and appropriations. The president executes foreign policy as commander-in-chief and chief executive. In other words, the founders intended foreign policy to be a shared responsibility between Congress and the president. Too often in modern Washington, we skip accountability altogether. The president attacks terrorist groups without declaring war. Congress authorizes unlimited commitments with no real strategy to get us out. Agencies execute, contractors profit. Think tanks provide propaganda, and if we dare ask basic questions as voters, we're told we're isolationist Putin apologists. No, asking questions is pro-American, and an originalist takes nothing at face value. An originalist American First viewpoint asks what the objective is, what's the constitutional authorization, what's the cost, what's our exit strategy, what is the cost to American taxpayers, how will this impact American readiness, how will this impact how will this commitment impact our border, our debt, our industrial base, our constitutional priorities at home and abroad? Asking these questions is not anti-Ukraine, it's pro-American and pro-Constitution. I'll give Congress this much. The discharge petition is allowed under House procedure. If members want to sign a petition to force a vote, that's using Congress, not being against Congress. But politically speaking, why is forcing a vote on foreign aid to Ukraine so urgent that Republicans need to use a discharge petition? Meanwhile, so many domestic issues can't get a simple majority vote in the committee. Why isn't there an urgency on border security? Why isn't there an urgency to cut spending? Why isn't there an urgency to protect American workers? Why isn't there an urgency to restore constitutional government? The Trump argument is not that we should be a weak America. The Trump argument is that American strength starts at home. Secure the border, rebuild the military, bring back energy dominance, stop endless wars and blank checks, require all our allies to pay their fair share, and only commit American power where American interests are directly at stake, like with going on in Iran. That makes sense, but funding money to Ukraine makes no sense. Europe funding money to Ukraine makes sense because Ukraine's in Eastern Europe. I mean, makes more sense for countries who are actually near Europe, who would actually suffer from Europe being taken by Russia, to have to support Ukraine's war. Doesn't mean they can't buy American missiles and American weapons, so our weapons manufacturers benefit, but we shouldn't be paying for it ourselves. And that is not isolationism. It's constitutional realism. In fact, it's far closer to the founders' warnings about permanent foreign entanglements than what both political parties have agreed to for decades. America First isn't constitutional realism. It demands that American power be used in the service of American interest and under American accountability. So look at how we've covered the procedure, checks and balances with the courts, money, agencies, and now foreign policy. Now, I'm going to go ahead and bring it home, come to the closing segment. So here's the common thread in all this. The first taking place in America, right? The fight taking place in America right now is not Republican versus Democrat. It's not Trump versus the media. It's not conservative versus progressive. The deeper fight is constitutional accountability versus institutional control. Constitutional accountability demands that power be exercised only if it can be traced to law and exercised by the right branch of government. If it's limited, it's reviewable. If it's answerable to the people. Institutional control argues that power should be exercised by judges, experts, agencies, procedural offers, central bankers, and other permanent fixtures in Washington who know better than voters. That is the real fight taking place, which is why Trump is so disruptive, because he doesn't just fight Democratic policy, he fights the idea that Washington's permanent political class can govern in defiance of elections. That's why they smear everything he does as authoritarian. But let's be honest with ourselves for a second. There is nothing authoritarian about asking Congress to vote. There is nothing authoritarian about enforcing immigration laws. There is nothing authoritarian about appointing judges who will follow the Constitution as written. There's nothing authoritarian about expecting federal agencies to be accountable to the president elected by the people. There is nothing authoritarian about questioning whether racial districting can go beyond what is allowed by the Constitution. There is nothing authoritarian about asking if foreign aid should benefit America first. There is nothing authoritarian about reminding the people that they, not the permanent bureaucracy, are sovereign. Can any president abuse power? Of course. Yes. Can Republicans abuse power? Absolutely. Can Trump do dumb things? Of course he can. That's why we have 3 branches of government in the Constitution. But the Constitution is not a tool that only Democrats should use against Trump. It is a restraint on powers against all comers. No kings means no lawless president, but it also means no imperial judiciary, no permanent administrative monarchy, no central bank that gathers worships at its altars instead of answering to Congress. Congressional procedures have become a way for politicians to avoid taking responsibility and acting with courage. No foreign policy locking America into permanent obligations without the public's clear consent. No federal judges legislating from the bench to reach ideological outcomes. No administrative agencies are not able to run wild, issuing guidance documents and enforcing laws they personally decide to like or dislike. If we say no kings, we need to mean it. And that is where originalism provides much needed clarity for conservatives. The Constitution isn't perfect because its authors or not, but it's the greatest restraint on government power that's ever been written into a governing document. And at this moment in time, conservatives' job is bigger than defending Trump's actions. Our job is to defend the constitutional order that makes our self-government possible. Trump is merely the elected vehicle carrying out the will of a populist revolt against consolidated power, but the principle is larger than Trump. It is this: we the people govern ourselves through the Constitution, not through bureaucratic approval processes, not through favorable editorials in the media, not through judicial reinterpretations of the law, not through administrative expedients, through the Constitution. That is the hill worth dying on. That's why tonight's stories are important. So before I get fully closing, I'm going to grab a drink and I was going to try to find one other section of notes I was going to cover. I don't know if anybody saw the other days, saw the primary votes this week, but pretty much Trump's on a roll again with all of the members that he supported. Obviously, Massey's out, which came after what's his name in Louisiana. It looks like Paxton is going to beat out Cornyn in Texas because Cornyn had his chance to get Trump's endorsement. All he had to do was get Thune to pass the SAVE Act. He couldn't even do that. And everything right now, based on the polling and everything, it looks like Paxton's going to level Cornyn on that. Also, Texans, you still have a couple days, I think, left of early voting. And then if I remember correctly, our primary runoff day vote is May 26th. So next Tuesday, I believe. And then that's about with all the elections as far as that goes. Foreign lobbying our government. So, Charlie, here's the problem with foreign lobbying. Yes, we obviously need to definitely go after that because foreign lobbyist is unconstitutional. Lobbying itself, though, is not unconstitutional. It's actually one of the biggest things about our Constitution, and it's the ability to go to our government for redress or redress our grievances with our government. That is lobbying. So lobbying can't be stopped on a local level or a national level as far as American citizens lobbying the government on their behalf. But as far as foreign agencies lobbying the government on their behalf, that's unconstitutional. Nowhere in there does it say foreign. That's actually against the law and unconstitutional. There's no way foreign lobbyists should be doing that. They figured out ways these days to bypass through shell companies and everything that make it look like they're an American company to do it. So obviously we probably need to make stronger rules and regulations about that so they can't get around those little loopholes and everything. And that goes back to the part where I was saying in my notes that I was reading a minute ago, where it was talking about let me try to see, where did I read it there? Trying to remember it says, wealth will continue to be created even in the absence of rule of law. Ironically, the pursuit of a more equal distribution of that wealth often results in formation of oligarchies consisting of those who know best how to manipulate rules, regulations, and especially discretion-wielding officials to serve their own ends, which pretty much is what we're seeing, especially with the lobbying. The lobbyists are sitting there and they've become so rich done stuff doing it, they figured out ways to create foreign companies that look like U.S. companies so they can lobby the American government on behalf of a foreign government, which is unconstitutional. So obviously we've got to work on get our Congress, the House, and the Senate to work on rules that are constitutional, legislation that are within the Constitution to stop that from happening. But as far as lobbying on a level, anybody in the U.S. government can lobby. Now, obviously, it's not like it used to be. I mean, back when the country first started, you could actually go up to the White House and sit with the president and speak to him. Now, obviously, nobody can get face to face with the president anymore like that. That stopped years ago, but that was your ability to go lobby your government. How can we do that when they're bought? That's why what Trump's trying to do with draining the Washington swamp, going after all of these rhinos that have been bought and paid for that do voting or bidding of everybody else but what they actually said. Like Massey, when he originally ran, said he was going to run on term limits. Did he take himself out of so many terms? No, he kept staying in. If you look at Governor DeSantis of Florida, when he ran for Senate or Congress, he ran on term limits, and he did term limits. He served a certain amount of time, and then he went to governor. So he served term limits. He didn't run just 9, 10 terms or whatever like Massey did. So that's another thing we've got to do is get the people that have been bought by that power out. And then that's going to be hard. It's going to take a long time to get those legislation. We need to get them back. We need to get back to forcing Congress to actually making full laws and legislation, not making broad maps that are then sent to individual agencies. And those agencies are the ones that actually draw up all the policy and stuff that enforces the law that you actually pay attention to day to day. That's one way. We've got to get the power from the government because that's how they're able to do it. Oh, yeah. I mean, it's whether, yeah, trust me, Paxton wasn't my favorite, but he's better than Cornyn. I would have rather had rather had Wesley Hunt, but Hunt didn't make the runoff. So that is what I would have rather have seen was Hunt, but Hunt didn't win the election. So between Paxton and Cornyn, I'm voting for Paxton because he's a lot better than Cornyn, and it's obviously I'm not going to not vote or vote for some writing candidate because then that gives the vote to the Democrats. Not voting or voting, well, not in this time anyways, but right now is the primary, so it really doesn't matter. Right now, if I don't give a vote or vote for somebody else, that's really just a vote towards Cornyn versus Paxton. But when it comes to the general election, I'd rather vote for Paxton than a Democrat or no Democrat. So we'll see. But alrighty, so that pretty much ends today's live. Today's podcast. I'm gonna go through the full closing segment, and then I'll get on to where I can start taking multi-guests and stuff get my phone set up over here and just be streaming from TikTok. So anybody that's watching on the YouTube or anything, please follow me over to TikTok if you want. But thanks for listening along with me this afternoon to No Kings on the Hill with Dr. Hill. If you enjoyed this episode and we helped you connect to the constitutional dots behind the headlines, please like, subscribe, share the show, and leave us a review. Tell us how we're doing, where you think we're spot on, where you think we're wrong, and what stories you'd like to see us tackle. And as you see our website scrolling across the bottom of your screen, No Kings on the Hill with drlaw.com. Please be sure to click over and check us out. That link will take you to all of our social media links, previous episodes you may have missed, and ways that you can support the show. Subscribe for free to access our weekly blog, or subscribe to one of our 3 paid tiers to help support our efforts to bring you daily episodes. Our paid tiers also unlock perks for patrons, such as a monthly opportunity to guest host, daily subscriber-only live streams, Discord chats, and more. Plus, you can even weigh in on what topic we cover next. And don't forget, we will be going live each Wednesday at 5 p.m. Central, 6 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, X, and Facebook via the Patriots Prayer Network, as well as YouTube and Facebook at No Kings on the Hill, X at Dr. Hill Law 42, and at Kick at No Kings on the Hill. As always, we cut through the talking points, we cut through the panic, we cut through the political theater, because this republic does not survive on slogans. It survives on truth. It survives on law, on order, liberty, on a constitution that still means what it says. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, staying grounded in our Constitution, and remember, no kings on the hill, only we the people in the rule of law. Good night, America.